Okay, Dr. Nadler, thanks for joining the show.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Now, Dr. Nadler, you're a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. You're also director of the Institute for Research in Humanities. You've also written a slew of books as it pertains to the Enlightenment, and particularly Spinoza. But before we get into that, I want to lay down some groundwork here. You want to give a little bit about your background and how you became so interested in philosophy?
Sure. I was an undergraduate at Washington University in St. Louis in the late 70s, and I had a professor there who I found truly inspiring. He had a lot of energy and enthusiasm, and I thought, that's what I want to do, and he became a lifelong mentor, and he was a scholar of 17th century philosophy, which maybe primed me to be working in the field. And then in graduate school, I just found that the thinkers and the problems I was most interested in were in the 17th century, mostly Cartesians, Descartes and his followers. And once you get into that field, it's hard to get out because there's so much interesting stuff going on there and so many problems. And it really is the 17th century, an extraordinarily rich period for philosophy.
Yeah, 100%. And I think actually another person I read quite a bit, Dr. Bart Ehrman, he had a similar background story where he was, going to Bible school and he had a professor that kind of did that same spark for him. Are you familiar with Bart Ehrman?
Yeah, yep.
Yeah, that great author, such as yourself. And, I think it was actually Dr. Ehrman that said of Spinoza that he was the first critic to take a historical approach to the Bible. My next question is going to be twofold. Who exactly was Spinoza, and do you agree with Dr. Ehrman's assessment, and why might Ehrman make that claim?
Well, I will first take the second question first. I absolutely agree. There were thinkers before Spinoza, Abraham ibn Ezra among medieval thinkers, and then Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century, who argued that Moses could not have written all of the parts of the Torah, especially the account of his own death and what happens after his death. But Spinoza, he was not the only person in the 17th century to argue this, but he really did lay out his case quite clearly in the Theological Political Treatise that the Bible is not in any literal sense a divine work, but rather is a compilation of human writings, a kind of anthology, writings that were handed down over the centuries, copied after copy after copy, and then finally selected and put together at some point during the Second Temple period. And so he really was a major player in the move to both naturalize the Bible and secularize it and show that it's just a work of human literature. What was your first question?
Yeah, give me more of Spinoza's background
Spinoza,
for the
right.
audience members who may not be 100% familiar.
So Spinoza was born in 1632 in Amsterdam, although his parents were immigrants from Portugal, and they belonged to an immigrant community of Portuguese Jews who started arriving and settling in Amsterdam at the beginning of the 17th century. Mostly they were conversos, or descendants of families that had once been Jewish but were forced to convert to Catholicism in Spain and Portugal. But when they started fleeing the Iberian Peninsula after horrific treatment by the Inquisition, because the Inquisition suspected that they were insincere in their conversions, when they landed in Amsterdam, they were able to revert to Judaism. And so Spinoza was born to this former converso family in a flourishing Jewish community of Portuguese or Sephardic Jews. However, in 1656, for reasons that we can only speculate about, he was put under cherem, or ban. I guess it's some kind of correlation with excommunication from that community. It was a harsh ban. It was never rescinded. It was the longest and most vitriolic, a very angry expulsion. And I think the best guess we have is that he was expelled for, already at that point, he was only 23 years old, and he hadn't written anything yet, for saying the kinds of things about God, about Jewish law, about the soul, about the Bible, that would later appear in his philosophical writings. So he left the Jewish community, and over the next two decades, began writing his major philosophical treatises. There's the Ethics, which is a metaphysical and moral work detailing how human beings are generally under bondage to the passions, but can achieve some kind of freedom, even in an absolutely deterministic world. And it's in the Ethics that you find his most clear and distinct presentation of his views on God. And then the Theological Political Treatise, which was published in 1670, and caused a great scandal for his views on religion, on the Bible, on miracles, and on prophecy, and also his views on politics. He thought that the publication of the Theological Political Treatise could kind of prepare the way for the publication of the Ethics, but the backlash against the treatise was so strong that he realized that he couldn't publish the Ethics under these circumstances. And so when he died in 1677 at the age of 44, the Ethics had not yet been published, but it was published along with his other writings soon after his death. And he would go on to become, in many ways, both the most vilified philosopher in Europe for the next 2 centuries, but also a great hero to many other thinkers and movements.
Yeah. No, I want to take a step back and go back to his banning, because it really is kind of puzzling to me, because he hadn't written yet.
He hadn't written anything yet.
Yeah. So what was the context of that? So like you had mentioned earlier, like Abraham Ibn Ezra made kind of similar points, or at least said that Moses couldn't have written the entire Torah. What was the mainstream beliefs in Judaism at the time? Because I feel like I'm in contact with, many Jews today that if you ask them, do you believe in God? Even something as simple as that, you might not get a straight answer, or sometimes the straight answer is just no. So what was the mainstream beliefs in Judaism at this time?
Well, it's hard to say what the mainstream beliefs were, because there's, even in the 17th century, before you have this division into Reform Judaism, Conservative Judaism, Orthodox Judaism, and so on, there really was just Judaism. But Rabbinic Judaism comes in many different flavors, and it depends, which rabbinic tradition. So if you look at, for example, rabbinic views on God, you get a very broad spectrum. There are some rabbinic traditions that view God in sort of the classic Abrahamic way that you see in the Hebrew Bible. God is a kind of person or moral agent with a certain psychological and ethical profile. But there are other philosophers, very authoritative ones, including, let's say, Maimonides, who cautioned us against looking at God in an anthropomorphic way. I think Spinoza went a little too far, and again, we don't really know what he was saying. The banning document, which we have, mentions only his horrifying heresies and atrocious deeds without telling us what they were. But if he was, around that time, describing God in the ways in which we see God described in the Ethics, and this is a God who is really identical with nature. Spinoza, as I argue in this new book, is an atheist, and not just in the 17th century sense. In the 17th century, to be called an atheist just meant that your God's not our God, and you could be labeled an atheist simply for believing in God, but not for believing in whatever sectarian religion or whatever group happened to think was the orthodox view of God. But I think Spinoza was an atheist in our contemporary sense. And so if around the time of the Cherem he was denying that there is any such thing as a divinity or divine providence or miracles, that would probably have drawn the attention of the leaders of the community and earned him a Cherem.
Yeah, let's start to bridge the conversation to your new book. How far did Spinoza's disbelief go? Did he think that, let's say, for example, Moses actually existed?
Yes, as far as we can tell, Moses existed, and there were some writings, some original texts by Moses, which formed the basis for the Torah. But a lot of what we read in the Torah today, while there may be snippets from Moses' original writings, those originals are long lost. But yeah, he doesn't doubt that there was an individual named Moses, but a lot of what the Torah says about Moses is the result of later authors and editing.
Yeah, is there much debate today on whether or not Moses existed entirely, or there just was someone named Moses, or how much of in the Hebrew Bible is mythical and how much is historical?
Yeah, I'm afraid that goes beyond my pay grade. I'm not really an expert in biblical history, but just as very few people doubt that there was probably almost certainly an individual named Jesus of Nazareth, I think as well people tend to accept the fact that there was a leader of the Hebrews named Moses, but there's skepticism now about whether there was enslavement in Egypt and what Moses' role may have been. I mean, the Bible really it's a novel in many respects, or let's say an anthology of writings, and it serves, and here I think Spinoza's view is important. It was composed and edited at a very particular historical moment for very specific historical and political and religious purposes. And so Moses is portrayed in the Torah in a very targeted way to perform the kind of political and religious role that the leaders of the remaining tribes of Israel in the Second Temple period needed to form political coherence.
Yeah. So let's get into that. Let's get into the book more. Spinoza, Atheist. It's coming out next week.
Yeah, a week from today, in fact.
Perfect. So how does this differ from what you've already written about Spinoza, and why the book now?
Yeah, it's a good question, because you'd think, I've published a bunch of books about Spinoza, haven't I said everything I've wanted to say? So there was the biography of Spinoza, which is straightforward life and introduction to his ideas. And then a book on Spinoza's heresy, which I lay out, putting the ban in its immediate historical context and in the context of Jewish thought on various topics. And then I wrote an introduction to Spinoza's ethics, in which I argue in one chapter that Spinoza was an atheist. And then I followed that up with a couple of articles in academic journals addressing that same question: is Spinoza a pantheist? Is he an atheist? But never really had the opportunity to lay out the full case, including looking at the question of what did it mean to be an atheist. What was it to be called an atheist in the 17th century? Why was it that Spinoza became a pantheist, or in the eyes of his readers, in the 18th century, and that became the dominant mode of categorizing Spinoza up until our present day? If you look at all of the discussions of Spinoza in encyclopedias and general histories of philosophy and specialized books on Spinoza, he's always called a pantheist. And even if you look at all the articles on pantheism and all the books on pantheism, Spinoza's held up as the model pantheist. So I thought that it's finally time to lay out my entire case. What does it mean to be an atheist? What does it mean to be a pantheist? And now he's also called a panentheist. And consider all of those options, looking at the historical traditions, and then to lay out at much greater length than I've done anywhere else why I think those are all wrong, and that in fact Spinoza is an atheist in the sense of not believing or rejecting any kind of real divinity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's double click on the pantheism. So here's a direct quote for Spinoza: "God's power is the very power of nature. If anything were to happen in nature which does not follow from her laws, that would necessarily be in contradiction with the order which God has established in nature." So briefly, how is that not pantheism? Like, I understand why he often gets that label. I think based on what I read of your work, I do agree with your claim that he's an atheist. But can you kind of disprove the pantheism label?
Yeah, I think I can. So what you've read is something that a pantheist could have written. It's also something that an atheist could have written. And that's because I think the pantheist and the atheist agree that all there is nature. There is no supernatural, there is no transcendent divinity or deity who stands outside of nature. Everything that is a part of and occurs within nature. And nature is the, I don't want to use the word agent because that sounds as if it personalizes it, but nature is the cause of everything that happens. So the pantheist and the atheist can agree on that. So from a metaphysical or ontological point of view, there seems to be no difference. The difference then has to be in what one is supposed to believe, or what is the proper attitude to take towards nature. And insofar as the pantheist is still a theist, I see the pantheist as somebody who looks at nature as a divinity, who divinizes nature, and therefore believes that nature is deserving of worshipful awe, adoration, reverence, or other sorts of religious attitudes. The atheist, however, while agreeing that all there is nature, would argue that there's nothing divine about nature. It's not deserving of reverence or worship or awe or adoration, and that nature should not be the object of any kind of reverential religious attitude, but rather the proper attitude to take towards nature is scientific understanding. And this seems to be exactly Spinoza's view. He says quite explicitly that we shouldn't gape at nature with wonder, but human flourishing depends upon our achieving a state of knowledge and understanding of nature by knowing what we are, how we are a part of nature, and how nature operates across the board.
Yep. So Spinoza, he never explicitly claimed to be an atheist, correct?
No, in fact, he denies it several times, but on the occasions when he denies it, it's a little tricky, because on one occasion he says, well, I'm not an atheist because I believe in the true religion. But Spinoza defines true religion as simply acting according to a certain moral code, namely treating other human beings with justice and charity. On another occasion when he denies being an atheist, and this is to a correspondent, he says, they wouldn't call me an atheist if they knew the kind of life I led. I'm not overly fond of honors and riches. So there, when he denies being an atheist means somebody who lives an immoral life. He says, well, I don't live an immoral life. But I can't think of an instance where he denies being an atheist in the sense that I reject divinity altogether. But then again, he's being cautious. He doesn't want to give more ammunition to those in the 17th century who are accusing him of atheism.
Yeah, it's funny because he does muddy the water sometimes. He has insisted on being a staunch defender of God, but then in another breath, here's another quote for you. Although I've been educated from boyhood in the accepted beliefs concerning Scripture, I have felt bound in the end to embrace other views. So he definitely, says things that maybe to one person might sound even more like a theist, but he says other things that it definitely has, kind of warranted the ban, or not warranted in the sense that, it should have happened, but you could see why other theists would, kind of balk at, some of his claims and some of his descriptions.
Also, he's a lot more careful in the theological political treatise. You can see, if you've read the Ethics and then you read the theological political treatise, you can see lurking underneath it all the views about God in the Ethics. But it's really only in the Ethics that you get a much stronger sense of his atheism.
Yeah, let's double click on the Ethics as well. So where does Spinoza think morality comes from, if not from God?
Reason. I think reason has, once you've achieved the life of reason, and you are guided by knowledge rather than the passions in how you treat other people and the choices you make in your manner of living. These are guided by what you now, as a rational and virtuous person, recognize as in your own best interest. So if by ethics you mean how are we supposed to treat other people, well, the individual that in the ethics Spinoza calls the free person realizes through reason that it's in their own best interest to help improve the lives of others, because then the people among whom you live will also be rationally virtuous. I don't think there are no absolute standards of good and bad for Spinoza. Nothing in and of itself is good and bad. Things are good and bad only relatively to how well they contribute to our flourishing as human beings, how well they improve us, make us more powerful and more perfect. But that's relativism. It's not subjectivism or nihilism. The things really are good or bad in relation to how well they contribute to our living good lives.
So you wouldn't label Spinoza a consequentialist?
Well, not to the extent that a consequentialist would say that an action is right or wrong depending upon how much overall good it produces. But I guess you could say he's a consequentialist in the sense that actions are right or wrong and things are good or bad depending upon their consequences for us as individuals and also for society. But it's not the kind of straightforward consequentialism that we'll find in the 19th century.
Right. So another thing I wanted to touch upon was the Stoics. How much did the Stoics influence Spinoza's beliefs?
I think a good deal, especially with respect to moral philosophy. The person who has achieved this condition of rational virtue, the free person, will have a greater power over their irrational passions, because what they see through their understanding and their knowledge of nature is that all things are necessitated by their causes, not just bodies and their motions, but also all of our mental states exist within an absolutely deterministic causal nexus. And once you grasp the necessity of all things, and you realize how little control you have over the comings and goings of things outside of us, including the things that we value. Like the Stoics, Spinoza believes that this condition of understanding weakens our passions, and we won't get overly upset over the loss of something or overly joyful at the acquisition of something. But Spinoza is also a critic of the Stoics. He doesn't think that we can eliminate the passions from our lives, and that wouldn't even be a desirable condition. But he does think that through the exercise of the intellect, through rational virtue, we can become more self-controlled, more autonomous, and we end up doing what we do not because of how things happen to make us feel, but because of what we know is truly in our own best interest.
Mm-hmm. And would Thomas Hobbes and Leviathan also be an influence for him?
Yeah, the thing about Spinoza is he is thinking right at this intersection of all these different influences. I think his political philosophy was strongly influenced by Hobbes, especially the propositions in Part 4 about the origins of the state and the theological political treatise, the political chapters there, and his views on conatus, that is the driving emotional or affective force that moves us. He found a lot of that in Hobbes. But there was also the influence exercised by Descartes and Cartesianism, by the ancient Stoics, but especially by medieval Jewish rationalism, Maimonides and Gersonides. And so the interesting thing about Spinoza is that he takes all of these intellectual traditions, but nonetheless comes up as an extraordinarily original thinker in his own right.
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong. I think he did kind of remark famously that he wanted to show that there was a difference between him and Hobbes and what he was writing, politically. Was that true that he did make some noises to that effect?
He did. He says explicitly that he and Hobbes differ on, for example, the question of rights. One of the important points of difference is that, unlike Hobbes, Spinoza believes that you can never truly give up your rights to the sovereign. It's impossible, because simply by virtue of being a living being with this conatus to persevere and to improve your condition, that's inalienable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that does make a lot of sense. Yeah, double click on that, actually. What did he mean?
We're doing a lot of double clicking.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. I want to get to it all. So what exactly did he mean by that? And how does that differ from what Hobbes was saying?
Well, Hobbes believes, there's Hobbes in the early work De Cive and then in Leviathan. But generally speaking, for Hobbes, the citizen gives up all their rights to the sovereign. That's part of the social contract. And the sovereign is not part of the social contract. If the sovereign commands you to, whatever the sovereign commands you to do, you are obliged to do, even if it means risking your life. I believe, if I remember correctly, the only resistance you can offer to the sovereign is if the sovereign comes after you to kill you. But Spinoza, given his view on conatus and on the social contract, the individual cannot possibly give up their right, because Spinoza identifies right with might and might with power. And so the power of the individual just is the individual. The other important difference between Spinoza and Hobbes, an important similarity, is that they both agree that the sovereign has absolute authority. Whether we're talking about civic affairs or public religious affairs, you cannot have a division of authority in the state. So the sovereign, whoever it is or whatever body it is, has absolute authority. However, the difference between Spinoza and Hobbes is that Hobbes thinks that monarchy would be the best form of sovereignty, where Spinoza argues that democracy is the best form of sovereignty, where the sovereign is a democratically elected deliberative body.
It's great stuff. Leviathan was one of my favorite books back in school, so it was great to hear you kind of dissect that. Kind of want to end it, bring it back to the book a little bit. Interesting question for you here. Can you steel man the other side? Can you maybe give the argument on how Spinoza might be a pantheist?
Well, I can't really, because I don't see that there's a good argument for that. There is the passage you read earlier that Spinoza identifies God and nature. The pantheist identifies God and nature, and so it's tempting to see him as a pantheist. Those who argue that he's a panentheist believe that, or I suppose as a pantheist as well, that the reason why we should think of Spinoza as a pantheist is because many of the attributes that are traditionally given to God, being infinite, being eternal, being all-powerful, these are attributes that Spinoza gives to nature. And so it looks like Spinoza is turning nature into God by saying nature is the infinite, eternal, all-powerful substance. But as I argue in the book, infinitude, eternity, and power, these are not necessarily divine features. If it turns out, let's say that scientists discover that the universe is, there was no Big Bang, the universe was eternal and is infinite, would that all of a sudden make the universe divine? Well, no. I think that we shouldn't regard that these particular attributes by themselves make something divine. In order to make it divine, you need an argument which gives us reason to think that nature is not only infinite and eternal and all-powerful, but is somehow providential, or at least in some sense deserving of worship, awe, reverence, fear, adoration, or any other kind of religious attitude. Because without that, you don't have a divinity. You just have nature.
It's great stuff. Dr. Nadler, where can people find the book?
It should be at fine stores everywhere. Go to your independent local bookseller or go to bookshop.org. You can order it there. I'm not a fan of Amazon these days, so if you can get it, bookshop.org would be a nice online way of getting it, and that way you support your local independent booksellers.
So I appreciate you coming on the show. I'm definitely going to have my friends and family get the book. Can't wait. Spinoza, Atheist. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks very much for having me.